Sarah Martinez stared at the price tag on the ground beef, her hand trembling slightly as she placed it back in the refrigerated case. $24.99 per pound. Just 3 months ago, it had been $7.99. The news had been full of reports about some new strain of bird flu mysteriously jumping to cattle, something the experts claimed they'd never seen before. Millions of cows across the Midwest had to be culled, with footage of mass graves dominating the evening news. The Agricultural Department claimed it was necessary to contain the outbreak, but that didn't make feeding her family any easier. She pulled out her phone and adjusted her grocery list for the 3rd time that morning, trying to figure out how to feed Tommy for another week on what little remained of her paycheck. Maybe eggs could provide some protein instead, but her heart sank as she rounded the corner to the dairy section. The same bird flu had decimated chicken populations across the country. First it hit the commercial farms in Iowa, then spread to Georgia, and finally California. Within weeks, nearly 30 million chickens had been culled. Now a single dozen eggs cost $15.99, when you could find them at all. The fluorescent lights of Savamart buzzed overhead as she pushed her cart past nearly empty shelves, each item she passed serving as another reminder of how dire things had become. The produce section, usually vibrant with colors, was sparse and wilted. A small bunch of Browning bananas went for $8, and a head of lettuce cost more than she made per hour at the diner. "Excuse me," a stock boy called out as he placed a new carton of eggs on the shelf. Sarah watched as an elderly woman rushed over, only to stop short at the price. The woman's shoulders slumped as she shuffled away empty-handed. Sarah's phone buzzed, a text from her landlord. "Reminder, rent increase takes effect next month." Her throat tightened as she did the mental math. Between the doubled rent and these food prices, something would have to give. But what do you cut when you're already down to the basics? Tommy's voice echoed in her head from breakfast that morning. "Mom, I'm still hungry." She'd been reducing his portions gradually, hoping he wouldn't notice. But of course he had. He was 12, growing fast, and always starving. The free lunch program at his school had been suspended due to supply chain issues, whatever that really meant. At the rice aisle, she reached for the large bag they usually bought, only to find it was now $35. She settled for the smaller bag, ignoring the voice in her head warning that it wouldn't last the week. As she turned the corner, she nearly collided with Mrs. McMillan from the apartment downstairs. The older woman's cart contained only ramen noodles and canned beans. "You too?" Mrs. McMillan asked softly, noticing Sarah's similarly sparse cart. "Yeah," Sarah nodded, attempting a smile. "Did you see they're saying it's because of some wheat fungus in the Midwest? And something about fertilizer shortages." "Always something new," Mrs. McMillan replied, shaking her head. "First the drought in California, then the mysterious fires at all those food processing plants, now this. My son says—" She stopped abruptly, glancing around before lowering her voice. "My son says something's not right about all this. Says he found some documents at work suggesting." A loud crash from the front of the store interrupted them. Near the entrance, 2 men were fighting over a cart full of canned goods, while a security guard rushed to intervene. Sarah had seen 3 similar incidents this week alone. "I should go," Mrs. McMillan whispered, quickly pushing her cart away. "Oh, and Sarah? I heard there's a new community shelter opening up near the old factory district. They're offering 3 meals a day and housing for families who need it. Maybe." She left the suggestion hanging in the air before hurrying off. Sarah watched her go, then looked down at her own pathetic cart. 6 items, and she was already over budget. Tommy's words echoed again. "Mom, I'm still hungry." Maybe she would look into that shelter after all. The walk home felt longer than usual, each step weighted by her nearly empty grocery bags and even heavier thoughts. Sarah cut through Peterson Park, where the community garden had once flourished. Now it lay barren, the soil contaminated by what officials called unexpected chemical runoff from last month's rains. Chain-link fence and warning signs surrounded the plots where her neighbors had once grown tomatoes and zucchini. 2 years ago, she would have called herself middle class. She'd had savings, a decent apartment, and never thought twice about buying Tommy new shoes when he needed them. Now her savings were gone, eaten away by endless price increases that somehow never seemed to stop. Every week, the news offered a different explanation. Supply chain issues, natural disasters, livestock diseases, agricultural collapse. But Mrs. McMillan's son wasn't the only one asking questions. People were starting to whisper that it all felt orchestrated, though such talk usually got shut down quickly on social media. A police siren wailed in the distance. Another food riot probably. They'd become common enough that the local news didn't even cover them anymore. Sarah clutched her grocery bags closer. Just last week, someone had been stabbed over a cart of groceries 3 blocks from her apartment. The reality of her situation hit her as she climbed the stairs to her 3rd-floor apartment. Even with her second job delivering food in the evenings, she couldn't keep up. The kitchen shelves were almost bare, and Tommy's clothes were getting too small. His shoes had holes, but new ones would mean no meat for a month. She'd started skipping meals herself, but she couldn't bear seeing her son go hungry. Sarah set the groceries on the counter and pulled out the pamphlet Mrs. McMillan had secretly slipped into her cart. New Hope Community Center, it read, providing shelter and sustenance for families in need. The glossy photos showed clean dormitories, dining halls, and even a school. It seemed too good to be true, but what choice did she have? Her phone buzzed again. Another late payment notice for the electricity bill. Outside her window, the old factory district loomed in the distance, its abandoned buildings now sporting fresh paint and new fencing. The community center was out there, promising 3 meals a day and a roof over their heads. Tommy could even continue his schooling. Sarah sank into a kitchen chair, the pamphlet trembling in her hands. The thought of living in a shelter had always seemed like a line she wouldn't cross. She was a hard worker, proud, independent. But pride wouldn't feed her son. Pride wouldn't keep him warm when the power got cut off. She pulled out her phone and dialed the number on the pamphlet. It rang twice before a warmly professional voice answered. New Hope Community Center, how can we help you? Sarah took a deep breath, thinking of Tommy's hungry eyes at breakfast. Yes, I'd like to learn more about your family housing program. Of course, the voice replied smoothly. We have an orientation tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. We're helping so many families just like yours. Shall I put your name down? Sarah glanced at their nearly empty kitchen, at the past-due bills piled on the counter, at Tommy's worn-out backpack by the door. Yes, she said finally. My name is Sarah Martinez. My son and I, we need help. Wonderful, Mrs. Martinez. We'll see you tomorrow at 9. Just follow the signs to Building C. And don't worry, everything's going to be better soon. As she hung up, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just crossed some invisible line. But with food prices still climbing and no end in sight, what other choice did she have? Tomorrow, she'd pack their essential belongings and take Tommy to see their potential new home. She just prayed she was making the right decision. What she couldn't know was that across town, in a sleek high-rise office, someone was adding her name to a very special list, and the words New Hope Community Center meant something very different from what she imagined. High above the city, in the penthouse suite of the Global Sustainability Tower, Philip Bates stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing down at the urban sprawl below. The city's lights twinkled like stars, though numerous dark patches marked areas where power had been temporarily cut due to infrastructure issues. He smiled, taking a sip of his 30-year-old scotch. The intake numbers are exceeding expectations, he said, turning to face the other figures seated around the mahogany conference table. The food crisis is proving even more effective than our models predicted. When people can't feed their children, it's remarkable how quickly their dignity evaporates. He clicked a remote, and a holographic display illuminated the center of the table, showing real-time statistics from various New Hope facilities across the country. We've processed over 50,000 individuals this quarter alone. The Martinez woman who just registered, she's typical of our target demographic. Single parent, service industry worker, no real assets or influential connections. The exact kind of surplus population that needs to be, shall we say, reorganized. Marcus Hawthorne, one of the 12 members of the Ecliptic Order, leaned forward. And the processing centers are secure? Completely, Bates replied. Once they enter, they're classified as voluntary residents. Legally, they don't exist anymore. We own their labor, their bodies, their futures. He chuckled. It's remarkable, they're actually thanking us for enslaving them. He switched the display to show footage from inside one of the facilities. Rows of people worked at assembly lines, producing electronics and textiles. Others tended vast indoor agricultural operations. They're proving quite useful, actually. The educated ones we put to work in our research facilities. The others handle manual labor. Zero wages, minimal food costs, and complete control. It's beautiful in its efficiency. And those who resist? Another member asked. Rare, but handled quietly. We have several more, intensive facilities for troublemakers. The beauty of it is, no one on the outside cares. They're too busy trying to survive themselves. Every price increase, every food shortage, every natural disaster pushes more of them into our arms. Bates walked back to the window, watching as a convoy of unmarked white trucks moved through the streets below. By the time we're done, the useless masses will have essentially culled themselves. They'll walk willingly into our camps and thank us for the privilege. He turned back to the group, his eyes cold. The order has waited centuries for this moment. The balance will be achieved, one desperate family at a time. And the benefactors? Hawthorne asked quietly. Will they be satisfied with our progress? They gave us a deadline and a target number, Bates replied. We're on schedule. The human herd is being culled, and the strongest specimens are being preserved for the next phase. Those who survive the camps will be perfect for what comes next. He didn't elaborate on what next meant, but a knowing look passed between the members. A soft chime interrupted them. Another family had just registered at a New Hope facility. Bates glanced at the name and smiled. Ah, the Martinez file has been processed. Building C, just as planned. Shall we watch her orientation tomorrow? It's always entertaining to see the moment they realize there's no going back. The members murmured in agreement, raising their glasses in a toast. Outside, another section of the city went dark. The next morning dawned gray and cold as Sarah and Tommy approached Building C of the New Hope Community Center. Tommy clutched their single suitcase. All they had left after selling most of their possessions to cover last month's rent. The facility looked newer than Sarah expected, its pristine white walls and manicured lawns standing in stark contrast to the decaying neighborhood around it. Welcome to New Hope. A smiling woman in a crisp blue uniform greeted them at the entrance. Her badge read Jessica. Mrs. Martinez, we're so glad you're here. And this must be Tommy. Her smile never quite reached her eyes. They were led through a series of checkpoints, each one requiring more detailed documentation and signatures. Standard procedure, Jessica assured them, sliding another form across the desk. Just authorizing school enrollment, medical care, housing assignment. The papers kept coming, the language growing increasingly complex. I don't understand all these terms, Sarah said, squinting at the fine print on page 17. Oh, just legal formalities, Jessica waved dismissively. Everyone signs them. You do want to provide a better life for your son, don't you? Tommy looked up at her with trusting eyes, and Sarah signed. They were separated for processing. Tommy to the youth wing for educational assessment, and Sarah to workforce classification. Don't worry, Jessica assured her as Tommy disappeared down a sterile white hallway. You'll see him at dinner. The workforce orientation room was underground. As Sarah descended the stairs with a group of other new arrivals, she noticed the doors had no internal handles. A man in the same blue uniform as Jessica began a presentation about community contributions and mandatory workforce participation. That's when Sarah saw it, through a window in the back of the room, overlooking a massive underground facility. Rows upon rows of people in gray uniforms worked assembly lines. They moved mechanically, eyes down, supervised by more blue uniformed staff. The windows in their area were covered by steel bars. As you can see, the man continued pleasantly, everyone here contributes to the greater good. You'll be assigned your stations shortly. Sarah stood up. I think there's been a mistake. Maybe this isn't right for us. I should get Tommy in. Please sit down, Mrs. Martinez, the man's voice hardened. You've already signed the residency agreements. And I'm afraid your son has already been placed in our youth education program. His smile turned cold. There's no going back now. But don't worry, you'll adapt. They all do. The doors locked with a heavy click. Around her, other new residents began to realize the truth, their faces shifting from confusion to horror. Through the window, Sarah watched the endless rows of workers below, understanding now that she was looking at her future. Somewhere above, Tommy was being processed into the youth program, probably still believing this was all for the best. A blue uniform appeared at her side with a gray jumpsuit and ID badge. Welcome to your new home, Mrs. Martinez. Your shift begins in 30 minutes. In his penthouse office, Philip Bates watched the security feed with satisfaction, raising his glass in a mock toast. Another successful intake, he murmured. The balance grows closer every day. Below ground, Sarah Martinez joined the rows of gray uniforms, becoming just another number in the ecliptic order's great game. Outside, the next group of desperate families approached Building C, their faces full of hope, unaware they were walking into a trap from which there was no escape.